So this is going to be a little bit of an awkward way to start a sermon, which is always a good thing to say before you start a sermon. But are there any Golden Girls fans out there? No? One. Thank you. Because I really wanted to start my sermon by saying, picture this, Kovno. And if any of you know, one of the characters on the show will always say, picture this, Sicily, 1945. So that's for my Golden Girls out there. So picture this. We're in Kovno, which is a city in central Lithuania. I don't know what year, but a real rabbi. This isn't one of those stories where it's about some guy named Shlomo in some random place in the old country. This is Rabbi Israel Salanter, who is the founder of the Musar movement, which some of you may have heard of. It's the Jewish ethics movement. And he somehow ends up stranded in Kovno for Shabbos. There's a lovely Jewish neighborhood, and imagine it, I'm sure this would happen in Memphis if a random rabbi was stranded here. Everyone's fighting over who gets to have the rabbi for dinner. So while everyone's arguing, somehow, finally, it's settled. The baker of the town will have Rabbi Salanter for Shabbos dinner. The reason they decided this was the baker didn't have any children, so the thought was the rabbi wouldn't be taking any food from any children. So it's just how they made decisions back then, I guess. But also it's like for Jewish Shabbat dinner, like you think they were going to be short anywhere, but I digress. So the baker and his wife welcome the rabbi to their Shabbat table, and everything is beautiful. You know, you have a special guest. They bring out the china. They bring out the special lace tablecloth that they haven't used since last Passover. Everything is set to perfection. It's all of the best for this special Shabbat to honor this great scholar, this great rabbi. And finally, Rabbi Salanter arrives for dinner, and they're ecstatic. They welcome him. He walks in, and suddenly, the baker realizes that the challahs are not covered. It's okay, you can gasp. I'll explain why later. The baker notices the challahs are not covered, and he starts shouting at his wife. We could make up a name for her. Gittel, sure, right? Kovno, Lithuania. Why didn't you cover the chalot? We have this great scholar here, this rabbi, and you didn't cover the challah? This is central to Judaism. We must cover the challah on Shabbat. His wife, as you might imagine, was feeling a little bit hurt, a little bit embarrassed, a little bit shamed. And so she ran off crying into the kitchen. Don't yell at your spouse at the Shabbat dinner table. It's just never a good idea. But, so as the wife goes to the kitchen, Rabbi Salanter and the baker are sitting at the table. And Rabbi Salanter says to the baker, "Baker, why do we cover the challah on Shabbat?" Does anyone out there know? I can tell you.
Don't call on me.
Oh, don't call on you? Okay. But I'm glad you know.
I know.
So, the baker answers, "This one's easy. I got this. The reason we cover the challah on Shabbat is because every other day of the week, we say the blessing over bread first. If bread is on the table, it is the blessing that comes first. On Shabbat, we not only have one blessing before it, but we have two. We have the candles and the wine. And so what the rabbis teach is that we cover the challah so as not to embarrass the challah, so the challah doesn't realize that it is third in line on Shabbat, where it's usually first. So it's kind of like earmuffs, for those of you who understand that. So the rabbi says, yeah, that's right. We do this so we don't embarrass the challah. However, I want you to think about, this is Rabbi Salanter talking to the baker, I want you to think about the fact that, as it turns out, bread is an inanimate object. And that while we cover the challah so as not to embarrass it, it's also something that reminds us we actually aren't supposed to embarrass others. And so the baker realized that what he had done to his wife was even worse than not covering the challah on Shabbat. And so we have the purpose of this law, this idea of covering the challah, to remind us to increase our sensitivity towards the feelings of others. So what in the world does this have to do with our Torah portion? Anybody? No, I'm just kidding. I did write it. So in our Torah portion this week, Parshat Balak, our verses tell us a story from the perspective of Bilam, who is a non-Israelite prophet. So it's kind of interesting that there is a prophet in the Torah who is not Israelite, just to put that out there. So he has received the ability from God to bless and to curse. And Balak, different from Bilam, Balak is the Moabite king, and he is terrified that the Israelites who are encamped on the outskirts of his kingdom are going to attack. So in an attempt to protect his land and preempt whatever threat he perceives, he hires Bilam for his powers and begs him to curse the Israelites to save the Moabite kingdom. Bilam, the prophet, tells Balak that he can only utter the words that God puts in his mouth. So talk about not making any promises. The next morning, after King Balak has approached the prophet Bilam, Bilam saddles his donkey, it's his mode of transportation, and heads off to meet the king. But suddenly, on the way to meet the king, Bilam's donkey started acting kind of strange. She would swerve from the road and go into the fields. Then later on, there was a vineyard with a wall next to it, and she smashed his leg in between the wall and the side of her. You can imagine Bilam's getting more and more frustrated. And then finally, she just laid down in the middle of the road. So as you might imagine, again, Bilam's it's like you think car troubles are bad, like try riding a donkey. But, so what he did every time she did something was he beat her with a stick. He beat his donkey every time she went off the path. And the other thing that was strange about this donkey is that God granted this donkey the ability to speak. So Shrek was not the first time, but this donkey could speak. And so she asked Bilam, she said, "What have I done to you that you've beaten me these 3 times? Am I the donkey you've been riding all along until this very day? Have I been in the habit of doing this to you?" Bilam had to admit she had never behaved this way before. So when we bring it to the modern times, it made me think immediately of my social psychology class from college and the fundamental attribution error concept. So if you've heard of it before, the fundamental attribution error, this is when someone assumes that unwanted or inappropriate behavior observed in someone else is a result of an internal character flaw in that person rather than due to extenuating circumstances. Oddly enough, psychologists note that when we are the one behaving in such a way, we are very understanding that it is our current situation that excuses our behavior. But in our Torah portion, Bilam assumed his donkey was just misbehaving, being crazy, when what actually happened was that God had planted an adversary, a fiery angel holding a large sword on the road that only the donkey could see. Bilam could not see it. So each time she swerved from the path, she was trying to avoid them from being destroyed by this dangerous being. After Bilam admitted that his donkey had never behaved this way in the past, our Torah portion continues and tells us that at that moment, God uncovered Bilam's eyes and allowed him to see the adversary, see this fiery angel in front of them. And then he understood that his donkey was actually helping him and not trying to hurt him. These 3 things may seem only tangentially related. The story I started with about why we cover the challah, the explanation of what was going on between Bilam, the prophet, and his donkey, and the fundamental attribution error. But I want to encourage you that whenever you next find yourself at a Shabbat table or at a Friday night service and you see that challah covered, remember the story of Rabbi Salanter. Remember that we cover the challah not to save it from embarrassment, but to also remind ourselves to save others from embarrassment. Remember the story of Bilam and his donkey. And when you see people act in ways that make your blood boil, take a step back and try to consider the external circumstances that may be contributing to their behavior. What this week's Torah portion, the story I shared, and the social psychology concept I reviewed this evening is meant to remind us that so often we go on autopilot, get caught up in our own lives, and forget to approach the world and each other with compassion, with the benefit of the doubt. Shabbat offers us the opportunity to reboot, to reorient ourselves toward kindness. May this day of rest be a day of cultivating compassion for ourselves, but most especially for others. And to that we say, Amen. And Shabbat Shalom.